Joining me today to discuss the escalating violence in Israel and Palestine is American political scientist Norman Finkelstein. Thanks so much for joining me today, Norm.
Thank you so much, Mona, for having me.
It's so unfortunate that we're here again today to discuss the similar situation that we did last time. How did we get here again?
Well, first of all, we have to make clear to the listeners what here is. There's a new outbreak of violence which has garnered a lot of media attention. And so I guess our responsibility here, first of all, is to explain what's going on.
To try to decipher it all, absolutely.
Right.
There's a lot of different opinions out there.
So I don't think there's much disagreement about the broad context of the current Palestinian resistance. It's an occupation that's now lasted nearly a half century. It began in 1967. So next year or a year after, it's going to be 50 years. An occupation in which people effectively, they have no future. It's a futureless future. There's no hope, there's no prospects for living a decent life for young people who are at the forefront of the current resistance. These unemployment in the West Bank is estimated about 30% for that age cohort, age 20s cohort, but it's probably around 50%. The 30% is considered a low estimate. And even the jobs that people do have, those who are employed, these are jobs that don't require any great skills, even though the Palestinian population is very educated. These are not skilled jobs. And as you know, in Palestinian society, because you are Palestinian, in Palestinian society, if you have no job, no occupation, then there are no prospects for your social life. You can't get married, you can't have children. So it's not just your professional life, your occupation that's left without a future, it's your whole life. People who can't afford a family can't get married. So that's the generation that's currently in revolt. And beyond the broad context of an occupation which has denied Palestinians basic rights, basic human rights, and the basic rights of to have any future, any crack at life's happiness. There is the specific context which most chronologies nowadays, if you look for example at AP, they say, Associated Press, they say it begins, the current round of revolt begins on July 31st, when the Israeli settlers torched the family home of the Dawabshe family, incinerated the child, and then the two parents also died subsequently. So there was the torching, incineration of the Dawabshe family.
What was the catalyst to that, though?
Interestingly enough, when settlers carry on what are called price tag revenge actions, which was the case with the Dawabshe family, it's not something that Palestinians did. It's when the Israeli government does something which is seen by the settlers as being too appeasing or placating of the Palestinians. Then they carry out what's called a price tag operation, namely the government pays a price for being too lenient to the Palestinians. So it wasn't even anything the Palestinians did.
It wasn't a specific incident of violence against the Israelis?
No. From what I've read, I could be mistaken at this point, but it was a fairly typical price tag operation against the Israeli government. And then the other catalyst for the current outbreak, the other catalyst was the fears among Palestinians that Israel is trying to change what's called the status quo in Al-Aqsa Mosque. There's been an escalation on the Israeli side of aggressive moves regarding what's called the status quo in Al-Aqsa Mosque, and that resulted on September 13th in several Palestinians barricading themselves in the mosque and throwing stones on the Israelis. Senior Israeli officials in the Knesset settler leaders, they've been flocking in unusually large numbers to the mosque, Al-Aqsa, and has caused Palestinian trepidation that this is just one more step in Israel's systematic eviction of Palestinians from their homeland. Those are the what you might call the larger context, and then the immediate triggers of the current round of fighting.
Speaking of the current round of fighting, although bloodshed is really common in that area of the world, it seems that this is sort of a different type of aggression that has taken place with the stabbings. Would this link to a third intifada? And can you discuss the difference in the wave of violence?
Right. I think that's an important point, because we don't want to get too semantical about, is it an intifada, as if you go to a dictionary, look for the definition, and see whether the definition fits what's happening. The reason we should look back is because we want to see what works and what doesn't.
Right.
The first intifada did work. It was remarkably successful.
Right.
And we have to figure out why it worked in order to judge what are the prospects for this intifada. I'm old enough to remember, for better or for worse, I'm old enough to remember the first intifada. I wrote a book on my own experience. I lived there off and on after 1987. Between 1988 and 1995, I went back every year and spent a few weeks in the occupied territories to experience the intifada firsthand. So here are, in my opinion, the reasons it succeeded, and also its distinguishing characteristics. Number one, the good luck of the Palestinians in the occupied territories, their leadership wasn't in Palestine. The leadership at the time had been exiled in Tunis after being expelled from Lebanon in 1982. So they didn't have the burden weighing down on them of a sclerotic and very corrupt leadership. The leadership was far away. That was a very fortunate thing for the Palestinians. Secondly, even though the leadership was far away, the grassroots organizations of the PLO were deeply entrenched in Palestinian society, and they were quite functional. They had the talent, the political talent was inside them. So you had the labor unions, the women's groups, you had the political parties. And immediately, almost immediately, as the first intifada began, it began spontaneously December 7th, 1987. There is a car accident, what seems to have been a car accident between Israeli settlers and Palestinians in Gaza. And then the accident erupts into, the accumulation of hate, anger, and so forth. It erupts into the first intifada. But almost immediately, even though it was spontaneous, the leadership, the organizations, not the leadership, thank God, far away in Tunis, but the popular organizations, they immediately leapt into action. In particular, by the way, the Communist Party. At that time, now it's called the People's Party. The Communist Party was on record as being for nonviolence. That was their, all along, that was their strategy. So this was their milieu, this was their element now, because it turned into a nonviolent revolt. But the important point is, within around, right at the beginning, they formed what was called the Unified National Command. And it was the political parties all together. Hamas was not there at the beginning, if my memory is correct. But apart from Hamas, they all joined together, all the political parties, very well organized, because they had experience, they had organizational experience. And everything was done with a lot of subtlety and cleverness. They used to deliver the bulletins each week. Somebody would come, nobody really knew who, and so on. It was all done very...
This all sounds very calculated for a spontaneous movement.
Right. Well, that's the point, Mona, because it started out spontaneous, but there were grassroots organizations in place which had a long experience in politics. Now you fast forward to the present. Unfortunately, the leadership is not far away. It's deeply entrenched in the West Bank. It's as sclerotic as ever. It's more corrupt than ever. And its apparatus is working for Israel. So you have your leadership working for the other side. Secondly, the grassroots organizations are gone. They've been hollowed out. And what happened? All the natural members of the grassroots organizations, they have been like a vacuum cleaner was applied to them, and they all ended up in NGOs in Ramallah. So what's replaced or displaced the mass organizations of the first Intifada, what's displaced, they have been displaced by these NGOs, non-government organizations in Ramallah, and the Europeans who pay for most of them, they give you a little office, they give you a computer, and they give you, relatively speaking, a privileged life. Ramallah is a very expensive city now, in case you don't know.
I do.
It's a very expensive city. So all the mass organizations have now been displaced by these phony NGOs, and they're not really non-government organizations. They're just a way to keep busy and also keep out of trouble those people, the activist types, the politically savvy types, who would previously were in the first Intifada. And that's why, to get back to your original question, you said that there seems to be a lot of bloodshed now. It's not like the first Intifada. That's totally true, because people have forgotten. My memory is pretty lucid on this, because I lived there then, and it was an important point in my life. The first Intifada, when it was dying out by 1990, it began to die out. First year was very successful, second year less successful. By 1990, at the time when Saddam invades Kuwait, August 2nd, 1990, when Saddam invades Kuwait, the Palestinians were cheering Saddam. And that was an indication that they had given up hope on themselves. They were looking for a savior again. In any case, leaving that aside, that's a digression.
Right.
For our purposes, when the first Intifada begins to die, there were a lot of knifings in Jerusalem and in the south. There were a lot of knifings. Knifings are, in my opinion, they're an indication of despair. You're losing. And this first Intifada began with the knifings. It didn't come after a period of hope. It came from the frustration and despair that marked the end of the first Intifada. So the challenge now, in my opinion, is something is happening. The song from the 1960s, something is happening here. Stop, look, da, da, da.
Yeah.
Something is happening here. How to channel it in a direction that it can produce something positive. And that's going to require the Palestinians, for whom these knifings have become a kind of signature, as the suicide bombings became the signature of what's called the Second Intifada,
Right.
which began September 29th, 2000, how to pull it back and channel the anger, the frustration, but also the courage, the integrity, how to channel that anger, frustration, but also courage and integrity in a direction which can produce positive results. Before we get to that question, I want to just quickly clarify what, at any rate, in my opinion, what is a positive result?
I was going to ask you, are you implying that it's an Intifada?
Well, the first Intifada, there were two things that made it successful. Number one, as I'm sure you know, even though you didn't live, I don't know, how old are you?
I'm 40. Thanks for putting me on blast.
But you were barely alive during the first Intifada. What made it successful was it completely transformed international public opinion. It was a public relations debacle for Israel,
Right.
because the images that were projected around the world were children with stones versus Israelis with Uzis.
Right.
That was the image. So the first achievement of the first Intifada, owing overwhelmingly to its nonviolence, was that it won over international public opinion. Knifings will never win over international public opinion. Let's leave aside whether they're legitimate or illegitimate. We'll get to that. But we can say, we can agree, there's going to be no quarrel between us. If it remains knifings, it's never going to win over international public opinion. The second big achievement of the First Intifada was it didn't scare Israeli society, it paralyzed Israeli society, which is very different because the First Intifada consisted of all of Palestinian society. You have a 3-year-old child, you mentioned to me. I tell you, I challenge you really, even if your child were 2, your child would have been participating in the First Intifada. Wow. I have pictures, my best friend Musa Abu Heshesh, his son Orwa, who's now a surgeon in Hebron, very smart guy, wonderful guy. I have pictures of him 2 years old throwing a stone at the Jeep.
Many would say that that's deplorable.
It wasn't, there was not even a question here of a value judgment. The child sees Jesh, the army. He threw a stone. The army kidnapped his father. His father was in jail for 6 months. His father was tortured. He didn't need anyone to tell him anything, as in he was incited, that's deplorable. He saw, I was standing with him on the road. An Israeli Jeep went by, he picked up a stone, Jesh, army. The point being that First Intifada, it mobilized the whole of Palestinian society. Israel's a small place. In order to repress the whole of a society, you have to mobilize your whole society. And that meant Israel not only mobilized its army, it had to mobilize all of its reserves, its reserve army. And so when you were in the occupied territories back then, you saw Israelis, I'm serious, they were in their 60s, wearing fatigues. They were already portly and bald, but they needed everybody to police this First Intifada. If it's just knifings, it's not going to paralyze Israeli society.
You say
Let me just give you an example. In the 1980s in New York, we had, believe it or not, it's hard to believe now, we had 40 homicides a week. It was over 2,000 a year. It was like 2,200 a year.
Wow.
But even 40 homicides a week, it didn't paralyze the city. Though that kind of violence, whether it's homicides, that was during the crack epidemic in New York, or knifings, it'll not paralyze the society. A mass mobilization, that will paralyze the society. So, if you look at the 2 achievements of the First Intifada, achievement number 1, garnering international support, achievement number 2, paralyzing Israeli society, you can't achieve those goals with knifings. It's just not going to happen.